We have spent some time looking at the nature of the spiritual journey of a monk, the goal of purity of heart, the life stages and dynamics of psychological and spiritual growth. But in some ways, what we have said so far still begs the question, how do we become monastics? How do the insights of a document written 1,500 years ago, designed for small groups of celibate men living apart from the world, help modern people who are not vowed religious? Perhaps this is where we explore a definition that might help us bridge the gap between Benedict's world and our own. As we move forward, we will define Benedictine monasticism as a comprehensive, integrated way of life in which all aspects are designed to allow us to focus more clearly on God and to bring us to transformation. Let us begin to unpack this definition. The way of life set forth in Benedict's rule made provision for virtually every possible aspect of the life of the monk. One of the things that is disconcerting or hard to understand for modern people reading the rule is the way that Benedict can swing from the heights of spiritual insights to the depths of minutiae, all within a page or even a single chapter. In one chapter, he may be talking about how our hearts are transformed by humility, and in the next chapter, he is describing the exact day, hour, and psalms for an hour of prayer. Benedict alternates between the ideal of good zeal for monks and how many cooked dishes the monks should have for their meals. It is clear that the rule is indeed comprehensive, but how does this help us on our spiritual journey? Benedict was a very wise and practical man who knew about human beings, even when they want to grow in their spiritual life, are very prone to excuses, distractions, lack of focus. We want to pray more, but we get busy. We want to be more loving, but there is always someone who gets on our last nerve. We want to be of greater service to our neighbor, but there are so many things that we have to accomplish here at home. Does this sound familiar? All of us are easily thwarted in our good intentions. So what Benedict does is create a life in which everyone is given all that they need so that they have the time, space, energy, and support to truly be about knowing God more deeply. In other words, Benedict is setting up a way of life in which there are no excuses for not being intentional about transformation. What may look to us like trivial details in the rule are actually Benedict's way of making sure that his monks' basic needs were taken care of so that they could focus on the deeper meaning of their spiritual journey. Benedict made sure that everyone had enough food, enough clothes, a place to live, the support they needed to do their work, a practical daily schedule, and the leadership to keep community functioning. What seems to us like a focus on non-spiritual details was actually a way to help his monks stay focused on the spiritual. So the way of life that Benedict sets out is comprehensive, but also integrated. There is no real distinction between the spiritual, God-centered, faith-oriented aspects of life and anything else in daily life. Serving meals, working in the kitchen, harvesting the crops, taking care of the goods of the monastery are not distinguished from coming to prayer, meditating on scripture, or participating in liturgy. For Benedict, it is all of one piece. We will see as we continue to explore this topic that Benedict is creating a life beyond the compartmentalization and boundaries that separate the sacred and secular, and which tend to characterize our modern lives. So how does Benedict achieve this goal of making monastic life integrated and comprehensive? Here we come to a key piece of understanding Benedict and his rule. Benedict creates a life of structures and practices that allow his monks to live out their spiritual lives, spiritual values with integrity. People come to monastic life because of their surpassing value in having a life focused on God, and Benedict's rule helps people to create concrete, specific ways of doing that. In other words, Benedictine life creates structures and practices that help people live out their values. This idea of structures and practices that help us live out our values is one that we will come back to over and over. Let us look at some concrete examples. If you say that family is a crucial value for you, but you don't spend time with your family, don't support them financially, don't communicate with them regularly, then is family really a value? If family really is an important value, then you schedule regular time for meals together, for visiting, for reunions. You call, email, or get together on a regular basis. You have specific ways that you support them when they are in need. Each of these are concrete ways of interacting with your family and constitute a structure or a practice that helps you live out your value. Similarly, if you say that your spirituality is a value, but you don't have a regular practice of prayer, you don't participate in a faith community, you regularly engage in unethical activities, you don't do any spiritual reading or participate in activities that help you grow in faith, then is spirituality really a value? Again, to live out your value, you begin to create structures and practices whereby you get the support of a faith community. You have a specific prayer time and practice. You do regular reading, meet with a spiritual director, go on retreats, etc. As we explore this concept more deeply, we see that Benedict is creating a way of life in which structures and practices of faith enable and strengthen the values of faith. The ultimate value for Benedict is that we come to purity of heart, that we climb the ladder of humility, that we are transformed into the image of Christ. But to do this, we need more than a vague desire and good intentions. Benedictine monasticism is about translating the desires and good intentions of our values into concrete structures and practices. We will continue to develop this idea of values, structures, and practices throughout this program, but let's start with a look at some of the specific ways Benedict builds this monastic way of life. In the very beginning of this program, we talked about listening. Listen is the very first word of the rule. Listening is foundational in the spiritual life. If we don't listen to God, to ourselves, to others, then we won't be able to grow and become the people we were created to be. So we can clearly say that listening is a core foundational value for Benedict. Listen is at the core of the rule and the core of our life as monks in the practice of being open to listen to God. This listening happens with the ear of our heart. Listening for Benedict was not about listening for information, listening so that we can be ready to respond with our own thoughts. Listening is an inclusive openness to the presence, to the whispering of God in our lives. We also see listening throughout the rule in the relationship between community members. We see that the abbot, the head of the community, is supposed to listen to all the members of the monastery. There are special provisions made for the wise elders to listen in a special, compassionate way to the members who are struggling. Part of the definition of love is that monks are supposed to listen to one another. In common prayer, everyone comes together to listen to God. We can begin to explore this idea of values by asking ourselves about our own practice of listening. How well do we listen? Are we open and attentive to others, to God? Do we tend to listen with our intellect, taking in information? Or are we able to listen with the ear of our heart, with an openness, rather than listening for what we already assume or want to hear? So if listening is a key value, how does one go about learning to listen? How do you live out the value of listening in your life? One of the ways Benedict inculcates the value of listening in the lives of his monks was to emphasize the practice of silence. We cannot learn to listen well if we do not know how to create a practice of silence in our lives. We know that this practice of silence is critical in monastic life because Benedict devotes an entire chapter in his rule to silence. Benedict sets out a way of life in which silence is normative and times for speaking are the exception. Benedict has his monks ask permission to speak. He seeks to create a culture of quiet and silence in the monastery. In contemporary monasteries, this value is still practiced in the structure of having a period of the grand silence. At St. Gertrude's, it is 9 p.m. to 9 a.m. Whether in Benedict's monastery or in St. Gertrude's, the importance placed on silence doesn't mean that there is never any noise or talking. It simply means that we are trying to create a structure, certain times when we agree to limit conversation in order to facilitate living the value of listening. As we go forward in this unit, we will look at a number of other examples of how Benedict translates key monastic values into the structures and practices that help his monks live out those values in concrete ways. But let's also take a look at another key concept of Benedictine monasticism. At the end of the rule, Benedict makes a comment that has confused and distressed people for 1,500 years. He says that his is a little rule for beginners, and he goes on to cite other important monastic authors that monks should emulate. At first glance, it might look like Benedict is just being modest. Or, many people react by saying that if Benedict's rule is for beginners, they would hate to see the rule for the advanced monks. But if we understand Benedict's focus on the structures and practices of monastic life, then we can see what Benedict is really saying. In his rule, Benedict spends a lot of time focusing on external practices. As you see when you read the rule, he has very detailed instructions for all kinds of things, which psalms to say, what clothing the monks are to have, exactly how to elect an abbot, etc., etc. To modern people, these things look silly and irrelevant. However, Benedict understood human nature and knew that real, long-term change in attitudes and behavior works best if we begin with concrete, specific actions, and then gradually over time we begin to interiorize the attitudes and beliefs that constitute the basis for those actions. Benedict's rule is for beginners because it focuses on exterior actions, behaviors, and practices, because it is through those means that our deeper attitudes and mindset are changed. In other words, we don't become better, more faithful, transformed people by just wanting to be. It is through our behavior and attitudes that we demonstrate that we are actively cooperating with the action of God's grace in our lives. Let's look at an example. If children are told to do or not do something, they need to know the concrete, specific consequences of doing or not doing an action. You don't say to your 5-year-old, don't play Frisbee with the DVD because it is expensive and hard to replace. You probably say, don't do that or you will have a timeout. Eventually, as the child grows and matures, they will go from obeying out of fear of punishment to a deeper understanding of why an action is hurtful or wrong in a more abstract way. Hopefully, most of us as adults make it a practice not to take things that belong to other people, not because we could go to jail for it, but because we know it is wrong. We have gone from doing or not doing something because we would get in trouble, and gradually interiorized the deeper values until they become an integral part of ourselves. An example in Benedict's rule is how he treats prayer. In this little rule for beginners, prayer is something that is pretty rigidly legislated. He has his monks drop everything and come to the chapel to pray 8 times a day. Not only that, but Benedict is very specific about how common prayer is to be practiced, which psalms and readings and what times of the day. He further goes on to require several hours a day of Lectio Divina, praying with Scripture. So in other words, the monks of Benedict's monastery didn't have a whole lot of flexibility in their prayer practice. But if you think about it, what would have happened when the monks prayed this way, day in and day out, over the course of years? Presumably, hopefully, the prayer would go from being a discipline that they had to make themselves do to becoming something that eventually resided deep in their bones. The words of Scripture, the sense of the presence of God, would become an ongoing experience. They would be living what the Apostle Paul commanded, to pray without ceasing. The structure and practice of prayer is slowly interiorized until it becomes second nature. It is no longer an action, but the fruit of a changed heart. So when we look at the rule and try to understand what Benedict is doing and how it translates to the lives of modern people, we will keep coming back to 2 main ideas. First, Benedict creates practices and structures in the monastic life that help us to live out the important values of monastic life. Second, we begin with concrete practices and structures in our spiritual journey because that is the most effective way to gradually interiorize and be transformed by the values that these practices represent. We are indeed learners in Benedict's school of the Lord's service. We begin with a little rule for beginners because over time, with faith and perseverance, we will truly know the heights that Benedict talks about.